with, so it's
Hello and welcome to what is now, I think, the 8th interview for the EVPA Transformative Finance Lab series. Very happy to have Ben here with us today from San Francisco, and Ben is the Associate Director of Global Innovation Lab for Climate Finance, which I hope I've got correct. And basically, before we kick off, as always, these are quite informal sessions, but as well as the people joining us today, they are recorded and saved on the website. So if you are viewing this via the website or any other avenue, please do visit the website at www.evpa.edu.com, where you'll find this alongside hopefully by the time you come to it, another 10 videos and transcripts and lots more information that will hopefully provide a really interesting research base for others that want to get involved in innovation or lab spaces. So the format for today is we'll just hand over to Ben in a minute or two for a quick overview on the lab and the process, and then we'll break out into kind of an informal Q&A. So I know myself and my colleague Anya, who both here from EVPA, have some questions in mind, but also if you're joining us today, feel free to either add questions in the chat or just switch on a camera and ask a question when we get to it later on in the session. And the last thing I wanted to do just before we get going, and just in case people are joining us on a video later, is give a very quick snapshot of why we're here really, and what the purpose is behind this process. So EVPA is very fortunate to be supported with the support of the Jacobs Foundation to be on a journey to explore the possibility of prototyping a transformational finance lab. This is a co-creative design process, so we can't tell you exactly what that lab might look like at this precise moment, but what we were driven by is some very simple ideas that not only we thought of, but also have come to us from our members. And the basic core principle of this is that a lot of the problems we're facing or trying to solve in the world today are very complex, very messy, and come from a lot of different sources, whereas the solutions that are being brought to bear on these are often created in a very opposite scenario. So in darkened rooms on their own, jealously guarded. And we just felt there was a gap there. And our members at EVPA agreed, and some other externals as well, that there should be a space where people can come together and possibly come to a common understanding of problems, look at this at a systems-wide level, and hopefully co-create some solutions to those problems to make the world a better place. And that's the very large top scale idea that we're going towards and we're traveling towards. And as part of that process, we're now in the midst of these interviews, which we decided to host as an open resource, as mentioned, both so that people can access in the future, but also to walk the walk as an open co-creative process and to see what we're doing. And these interviews lead up to 2 more events, dates for your diary, depending on when you're watching this video. One is an Impact for Breakfast event, which will be held on March the 30th. And that will be a great opportunity to come and join us. The links are available on our website to hear where we are so far with our work on the Transformation Finance Lab, but also an opportunity for you to really feed into where we go next with the lab as well, and help identify challenges and get involved. And that will then roll into, on May the 3rd, a design workshop that we're hosting to really put some meat on the bones of this Transformative Finance Lab as we come into the end of the year. If you're interested in attending either, please do visit our website and find further links, or get in touch with myself or my colleague Anya, who's on this call and leading this work at EVPA. I think I've covered just about everything. I'm looking for a nod. That's a nod from Anya, so I have. And so with no further ado, I'd like to kind of welcome Ben, and possibly Ben, if you can give us a quick overview of your work thus far, that'd be great.
Sure. Thanks so much, Peter and Anya, for having me. It's always exciting to connect with others in the innovation and impact lab communities that are driving this work forward. As you said, Peter, I think quite astutely, there are some very significant challenges facing us in the world today. Certainly not least of which is the climate crisis and how to mitigate and reduce emissions and mitigate as well as mitigate the impacts of climate change through adaptation and resilience. I am very happy to be working in this space with so many other creative practitioners that are looking outside of those black boxes and dark rooms, as you've said, and approaching the future with optimism and with a mindset of innovation and inclusion that really helps to inform lab-like programs all around the world, addressing various challenges, both within and outside of the climate space. So with that in mind, yeah, I'm happy just to give a really quick informal overview of the labs. Just, there we go. Is that showing up? Great. Before we get into a little bit more of a conversation here. So the Global Innovation Lab for Climate Finance, or the lab, was established in 2014 and came out of the donor government climate finance ministerials in the sort of lead up to the establishment of the Paris Agreement. And the theory of change and the mission behind the lab is to basically function as a public-private network of investors and experts in the climate finance space that functions like an accelerator program. So going to the market to identify and then developing and launching new innovative financial instruments that have the potential to leverage billions of dollars in private investment into mitigation and adaptation projects in developing countries. So what does that mean for someone who is not in the blended finance or innovative finance space specifically? The theory behind this is that public money, so money coming from governments around the world, whether that be distributed locally or internationally in the form of overseas development assistance, or coming from the various multilateral and bilateral development finance institutions around the world. This funding is very limited, and it's clear that there is a massive gap between the funding that is currently going into climate from a mitigation perspective and an adaptation perspective, and what is needed. Climate Policy Initiative, the Secretariat for the lab, where I work, in addition to running the lab, we also track global investment trends in climate finance, and we have found that global investment has been going up steadily, but not nearly at the pace needed. I think we saw about somewhere around $630 billion US on average over the past couple of years, going into climate finance, but the gap is really somewhere in the neighborhood of 4 to 5 trillion a year at least, needed between now and 2030, basically. So we don't have a lot of time. We're far behind. And the vast majority of that money is going to need to come from the private sector. So using the limited donor funding and public funding effectively to de-risk and bring in private capital that wouldn't ordinarily be flowing into climate projects in developing countries is really the mission of the lab. And we work a lot in what is called blended finance, which is essentially transactions or instruments that, whether they be funds or other financial products, that use a typically smaller amount of donor funding or concessional funding, which is debt or equity that's being delivered at lower than market terms, in order to unlock private capital at scale. So the lab works in that space. We've developed 55 different instruments over the past 7 years. These have ranged from various types of structured funds and private equity vehicles, bonds and other debt instruments, insurance products, credit products, in certain cases, fintechs and other startups, along with pay as you save and pay for success type solutions, but they all sort of have this unifying goal of how do we use limited public or concessional capital that's able to take on more risk than private capital really effectively to change the investment landscape when it comes to climate finance. So I swear that will be the longest slide I will present. This is just a really quick snapshot of our network. So the lab is really fortunate to have a strong network of governments and development finance institutions and private sector partners that contribute to this program. They help to select the cohort, each year that goes through. This year we have 7 ideas out of about 160 that applied to the program, so it's very competitive, and these folks give their time to basically select the best ideas to get into our technical assistance program, and then in many cases they're funding them as well. So this is just a quick snapshot of some impact statistics. So over the last 7 years, lab instruments have mobilized over 3.2, actually just under 3.3 billion at this point US dollars for concrete projects in emerging economies around the world. About 440 million of that has come from the lab member institutions. So those were all of those logos that you saw on the previous slide, with the an additional 2.7 billion or so coming in the form of co-investment. So this is just sort of a snapshot of that. We're really proud to see over $1 billion coming in from pension funds and institutional investors. This is the type of capital that we really need to unlock, and that in many cases is not flowing actively into emerging market climate projects. So these are just some of the investors, private investors that have participated in funding lab instruments. This is a look just in terms of our impacts across sectors. We have a strong focus on energy and infrastructure, but also focus on climate risk, agriculture and land use, as well as energy efficiency and the built environment. And it focused a lot in off-grid energy access as well. So addressing SDG 7 while also reducing emissions. And you can see the geographic footprint down below. We're pretty equally spread between Asia, Africa, and Latin America, with a number of instruments having a global focus. Again, the lab is exclusively looking at emerging markets. And concurrently, this is a look at some of the SDGs that lab instruments support. Just quickly before we go into the more informal session, this is just a look at how the program works. So it functions on a yearly basis. Each year in October, we launch what we call the Call for Ideas. We receive submissions from all types of proponents. We've worked with small startups based in Africa, Brazil, or India or other economies that might be 1 or 2 people that have a great idea for an innovative finance vehicle, small asset managers and other fund managers, financial services companies. We've also worked with pretty large institutions, corporates, development banks, government entities, cities in some cases. We really have a very open program in terms of who can apply and who can benefit from this. But ultimately, once my team does the initial screening, then we turn over the best ideas to the members for a number of different rounds of meetings and virtual voting. And then at the end of that process, which just concluded a couple of weeks ago for this year's cycle, we'll take a small number of those forward into about 9 months of pretty intensive technical assistance to focus on the instrument design, the capital stack, the impact assessment, and the pathway to market, and putting together the necessary partnerships to bring something like this forward. It's a CPI team, and then we usually get about 15 different institutions from the membership or others to serve on what we call a working group to kind of co-develop these concepts over that initial 8 or 9 month period. At the end of this phase, each September, at the margins of Climate Week, we hold what we call the endorsement, which is basically the lab members sign off that each of these ideas that have been selected in each cohort are ready to move into the fundraising and investment stage. And after that, we spend about a year working with the proponent teams on go-to-market strategies, supporting proposal development, pitch decks, investor relations, matchmaking, and sort of everything that has to do with fundraising and getting these instruments on the ground. So throughout this, our role is kind of moving from pre-pilot, early stage, but well-established concept, all the way through to pilot, in many cases, raising for a first close or a milestone that would then end up leading to impact on the ground, whether that be a building of a microgrid establishment or a series of solar home systems on rooftops. In many cases, a technical assistance fund or facility that could help smallholder farmers improve climate smart agriculture practices and have access to capital. These are some examples of some of the on the ground programs that we've supported. Off-grid energy access for villages, schools, hospitals, communities as well. So kind of going from that early stage through the financial innovation process into structuring a fund, then raising funding, moving into impact on the ground. So that's sort of the whole lab process from start to finish. This is just my final slide, a look at this year's cycle. I don't have the list of this year's instruments on here yet, but you can find them on our website, which I'll circulate later. But just to look at our sort of focuses that shift each year. We have regional programs operating in Brazil, India, and Southern Africa, and then a focus in our global thematic streams on adaptation, sustainable food systems, and zero carbon buildings. And then we had a very interesting nature-based solutions, a carbon credit type idea that made it into the wildcard category, which we keep open every year just to make sure we're opening something up for the best idea that may not fit into these given categories that we define with our steering group of funders each year. So I'll pause now. Hopefully that was helpful. It was, I think, a little over the 10 minutes that I promised, but we can, I think, move into the next phase now.
Fantastic. I don't know if you can stop the screen sharing, or if it'll, look at that. After 2 years of living on Zoom, I'm still impressed.
Imagine that.
Yeah, exactly.
Except I still forget that I'm on mute at least once a week.
Exactly. Well, yeah, I did that earlier, so I've got that out of the way. I just thank you so much for that. I did have one quick question, if I may, just since you finished on the slide there for 2022 and the kind of thematics. Could you just give us a little bit more background on your kind of open calls for submissions? So I'm wondering, two things just struck me. Number one, it sounded so open that I got a bit scared if I would put myself in the footsteps of someone applying, because it's just so they'll do anything. But then also you mentioned the steering group kind of putting thematic kind of focuses on it, I think. And how does that actually kind of work on a year-to-year basis? Can you give a little bit more color to that?
Sure. We've definitely found that defining thematic and regional streams within the call for ideas has really helped to refine and target the types of submissions that we get. In the first couple of years of the lab, before we'd established the regional programs, we sort of welcomed any mitigation or adaptation oriented idea, and they were quite broad. We had a number of really great submissions, but it was a lot more challenging to screen through them, and you'd end up I think duplicating efforts a lot more and getting many sort of similar proposals, whereas that's less of an issue now. The other piece is that within the way that the regional programs work is we actually have regional, what we call panels. That's sort of a subset of the membership. So we have 15 or so institutions that are a mix of international investors and climate finance experts, and from larger global institutions, as well as say regional banks that are focused on Brazil, other climate finance experts, academics, NGO representatives, et cetera, that are either members or observers within each of our regional programs. That really helps to get the word out to an informal network of proponents that are working in this space. It's much harder to do that if you don't have a strong presence on the ground. The lab is a truly global initiative that is led by developing country teams, and in many cases, developing country-based proponents. We think that's really important, that this is not an initiative that is housed solely within the global north, a bunch of US and European investors that are sort of making decisions and crowdsourcing ideas from other global north-based entities for projects in the global south. It's really important for us to be seen as an integrated initiative that is a piece of the communities where we work, and is tied in with the financial innovation communities and the climate action communities there, whether it be in sub-Saharan Africa, and in Latin America and India and the other markets where we work. So that's really helped, I think, to kind of target the proposals. But it's also just time. It's taken us 7 years to build this community and to really get our audience right. The numbers have actually, of total submissions, have actually come down a little bit in the last few years, but we see that as a really positive trend because the quality's gone up. We've made it, I think, more clear and what we're looking for, and have instituted a number of kind of screens that an applicant has to go through just to make sure when they're submitting an idea to the lab that it really is an innovative financial tool and not, say, a proposal for a company or a proposal for a project or a technology, all of which that is not really our space. We'll often give recommendations for other incubator and accelerator programs that are more in that space for applicants that might be outside of our scope. So I think it's been a mix of defining that well. We have the quite specific wording, so it's not just a category. We'll give a few paragraphs on exactly what we're looking for within each thematic category. So what does sustainable food systems mean in terms of financial innovation? Same thing with the zero carbon buildings or something like that. For the thematic categories, we often have theme-specific donors that are interested in a particular category, and then we'll usually work with those donors over a few months to just kind of push and pull and go back and forth in terms of what type of language we want to refine for the call, and where our team sees sort of the greatest priorities for impact for the lab. So it's a bit of a back and forth there. We fortunately work with some really creative and supportive donors that have helped to expand our thematic offering over time. So they're what make up what we call the steering group. So those are basically the funders that support the lab secretariat, that support CPI to run. Along with that larger group of institutions that you saw, those are the members that vote for the ideas, and in many cases are investing as well. I could have included a governance slide, so we have a little like bubble chart where you can see how all the various pieces fit in.
Well, no, but I was also just on that point. I found it quite interesting with the members as well. I've got a couple of questions, but I will ration myself so that I can let Anya ask some questions in a second. But one quick one on the members piece there. I mean, they are some impressive logos. I don't mean that badly, but there are impressive logos, and there's a lot of them. How much kind of time does it take up to keep them engaged, or how easy are you finding it to keep them engaged from year to year?
So I would say, as with most partnership initiatives, the level of engagement varies from institution to institution. We're pretty fortunate to have a quite engaged member base, many of whom have been involved for years, either at an institutional or at a personal level. We have a really action-driven sort of mandate for our members. It's not a passive program, so we expect them not only to review the ideas each year, which takes a decent amount of time, but also to join working groups. Many of the institutions see this as worth their time, because ultimately we're a pipeline generator for them. So, for instance, the Green Climate Fund has supported, I think, 5 or 6 different ideas that have come out of the lab, and have considered many others. We've had other development bank partners and donors that have supported 6 or 7 or 8 different solutions out of the 50 that have come through. So each year there's often something that may be of interest to them. So joining the working group and dedicating a little bit of time to this space is really valuable, because not only are they able to sort of see what's coming down the pipeline, and in many cases, it might not even be the ideas that are selected for the lab process, since they're also able to engage based on just funding and lack and capacity. There's only so many ideas that we can take forward each year. So even some of those have served as pipeline for some of our members. So I think that's really important in any kind of a lab type scenario, is making sure that you are that you're benefiting all of your members, which can be challenging because the different types of institutions have different mandates and different priorities. But having a really action-driven agenda and ensuring that you're adding value for those institutions helps to keep people engaged over time, and ensuring that the content and the outputs are relevant for them. So yes, obviously engagement over time is a challenge, especially with 60 or 70 different institutions that you're dealing with. But I think for us having it broken down by global membership and then by regional membership helps as well, because you're engaging with different people in the institution, as well as just ensuring that the outputs and the agenda really match with those institutions' needs.
And then
apologies, I'm going to go off video for just a second because I need to get a charger for my computer.
Yeah, no worries.
I don't want to drop off.
That's cool. Then, while we're just taking a little pause, just to warn people, and I'm going to ask that one more question. I'm sure Anya's got a couple of questions, but if any of the people who've joined us, thank you for joining us today. If you have questions, if you're feeling shy, feel free to pop them in the chat box that's available at the bottom, or otherwise happy to take your questions in sort of 5-10 minutes probably, if you've got some burning questions coming up. But I'm always wary of talking now to see. There we go. And filled that like a pro. My only other question I had, very briefly on that membership piece as well, was something that actually I probably just brought my own eyes to. So apologies, I probably just put this on top, but I wondered, it noticed that the past funders tended to be philanthropic capital, like on your slide anyway. I'm sure it's not exhaustive, but around sort of Oak Foundation, I think, and similar sort of funders. And I just wondered, is that because in the early days you didn't have this track record and there was a need for that kind of catalytic philanthropic capital to get you going, or am I just putting something on there? Did they come on board for thematic challenges and drop off?
So that's a little bit unclear. When we have on that slide where we have the funders, those are funders of CPI, of the Secretariat, not funders of the instruments. Yeah. So all of our funding on the CPI side has been secured via philanthropic or government donor partners as grants. So those past funders have essentially supported either a regional program or a thematic program that's no longer active. But with that in mind, philanthropic capital is also essential in whether it's in the form of working capital or taking a more risk tolerant position in many of the instruments themselves.
Absolutely. And so, Anya, I don't know if you had questions. I mean, I know you do. So
I always have many questions, as you know. Yeah, let's just see how this adds up to what has been said earlier. Ben, really thank you very much for this presentation. I like the way you present also the success of or the mission really of the lab, which I understand is both about mobilizing capital, and it's very impressive to see that it's 200 times mobilized what funders invested. I think this is really interesting. I don't know whether it was on your slides or in some other presentations. So that is really, if I was a donor, I would say, oh, wow, it makes a lot of sense to support a secretariat, because then there's so much money coming out. And then it also presented the different solutions. I'm just wondering whether sometimes when it comes to then fine-tuning the financial instruments, whether there could be a trade-off between financial instruments being designed in a way that they mobilize the big institutional capital and financial solutions that then have the best possible impact on the ground in terms of being poverty focused, for example, or addressing the needs of something that is maybe a little bit more expensive, a segment that is maybe more expensive to serve, for example, the smallholder farmers you mentioned earlier, compared to, just general agriculture investments, for example. So I wonder whether sometimes in your working groups, you also have these discussions where you see the tensions between the conflicting objectives between mobilizing capital on one hand and the way capital is then deployed.
That is a great question, Anya, and one that comes up perennially in the lab. There is certainly a trade-off in many cases between innovation and scale readiness, and sort of ability to harness institutional capital rapidly. Just so we have 4 guiding criteria in the lab. That is innovation, actionability, catalytic potential, and financial sustainability. And those sort of all work together to inform which types of ideas are the best fit for the lab. Ultimately, for us, innovation is not about trying to create something new. Despite the complex terms and often difficult to understand language, I feel like for non-finance folks, ultimately it's pretty simple, right? You're deploying debt or equity or grants in a few different ways, and there's only so many ways that you can do that. So we're not generally looking at some incredibly complicated structure that is truly new to the market. Innovation for us is really about trying to solve a market failure or a gap in the existing context with an effective financial tool that is leveraging public or concessional capital effectively. So that's sort of the way that we define innovation. In many cases, it's just, hey, this is a type of solution that's been tried and has been successful in a European or a US context, but simply doesn't exist in the Namibian market or in Rwanda or in Brazil. So that's just to say something about innovation. In terms of the trade-off between scale readiness and sort of the difficult sectors, the way that we approach that is sort of a dual focus. So we try to strike a balance each year in terms of the thematic categories that we come out with, as well as the finalists and ultimately the selected instruments that make it through. The the discussion between that trade-off has been a constant debate that always shows up at lab instruments. Different members have different perspectives on sort of where that balance should sit. And at times, I think we've swung more towards commercial readiness in certain cycles, and then swung the other direction, more towards the really difficult sectors. So working more in nature-based solutions and climate adaptation in agriculture and smallholder finance. So these are all pieces that are obviously more difficult to harness institutional capital out of the gate, and may have a really long runway to commercialization compared with say a fund that is more focused on infrastructure or on grid scale renewables in a market with say a more developed capital market or something like that. And the way we've approached that is it always comes down to both. And the lab's role, really, we kind of have this dual role to play, where we want to focus on early stage, higher risk, more innovative ventures in the spaces that are really not seeing any funding, energy access and adaptation, for instance, along with looking for rapid scale, but also solutions that can add value. So the big question that comes up often is, aside from our 4 criteria, is where is the lab adding value? We have a very specific network, we have a specific process, and our niche is really proponents that can benefit not only from just capital, of course everyone wants funding, but also the input and insights from this community, and the time and effort that the CPI team can dedicate to this, along with the working group. So it's a long answer, but it's a difficult and very relevant question, and something that's top of mind for us. So from the way we've operated in the past is we see a lot of value both in the really early stage, high risk sectors, and then also in the sort of more scale ready sectors that could also benefit from innovation and helping to bring in private capital at scale. So each year looks like a bit of a split between that, and I can certainly see it in this year's cohort. And we've had some ideas that have come in and have raised $160 or $200 million right out of the gate, and others that have taken years just to raise a little bit of initial funding. It also bears mentioning something that we're really actively looking at is, how do we help to fast track those more challenging ideas to market, since currently we don't have a working capital fund associated with the lab. Funding decisions are made bilaterally between the proponents and the members. And we're really hoping to have some kind of way to infuse a small amount of grant or returnable grant capital right out of the gate, especially for some of these smaller teams that are based in emerging markets, where a fairly small amount of impact investment or philanthropic capital can make a huge difference from a catalytic perspective. So we're always looking for philanthropic partners and others that can participate in this process, and ideally would like to have some kind of a fund or facility set up and housed either within or outside of the lab that helps to support the highest need proponents coming out of this program automatically. So that's something that we really hope to have set up in the next couple of years.
That is really interesting, and I completely see the case for it. I think it makes a lot of sense. But I understood actually that once you select an idea, you would have some pot of grant money that you would give to the proponents. Is that no? I thought it was something between 150K and 200K, or is that a different pot of money?
That's technical assistance time, basically. So this is CPI time and working groups time, not money.
Maybe you
and
have
in many cases, this is we've had most proponents say to us at the end of this process, especially given the track record of raising additional funding to the tune of hundreds of millions in total from the network, that actually the assistance provided, the design services and the access to the network and the co-creation aspect is a lot more valuable than, say, if we just offered 100 or 150,000 euro grant to the winners, since this is really support over time to get something like this off the ground. And this again speaks to your question about, yeah, ideally
you would have like to have both. So
absolutely,
be able
both would be
yes.
best. Yeah,
yes,
yeah.
yes.
So
no, I can completely
that's really one of the reasons we're hoping to move in this direction, either as a CPI itself or potentially with some partner institutions that we've been exploring this with. So how do we bridge the valley of death by not only providing intensive, rapid technical assistance, access to the market, but also some infusion of capital? Yeah,
exactly. It makes a lot of sense. And maybe by infusing some of this capital, donor grant capital, you would then even be able to raise even more commercial capital, because then also it mitigates some of the risk that maybe of the early stage of making this new innovation fly. Then that could also be an argument for some of the more risk-averse investors to come in and support that financing solution. What about then about the other sort of a commitment to by other finances to invest in these financing solutions? I mean, the way I understand is that at the moment it is a financial innovation. You put this up to the potential investors. They say, well, this is something we're interested in, and they engage in the process. Would there also not be a case that you actually attach to the lab, there would be some sort of investment facility where you can invest quickly, maybe some also the concessional amount of money that will be required to make these solutions fly?
Absolutely. That's sort of stage two. It's amazing. I'm so it sounds like I could have prompted you with these questions.
As if we prepared them before.
you can become a part of the lab team formally. Yes, absolutely. So that's sort of the next stage. So what we're looking at is probably either a single facility or more likely two, where one would be focused on working capital across a wider set of instruments that would be available either through the lab process or directly after endorsement. And the second piece would be, and this would also be coupled with technical assistance over time. So really, it would just be sort of an expanded lab-like program likely with a partner sort of overseeing the funds management for the either grants or returnable grants. This would be the catalytic capital facility, basically.
Exactly.
And then there would likely be another, say, fund or fund of funds that would help to support the lab or other financial innovations that are within the climate space with growth capital. So that would certainly be equity or potentially debt as well, that can be delivered at concessional terms, but this would be sort of more of a traditional fund. And that way that those, as you said, the capital decisions can be made more quickly and a bit more smoothly. Ultimately, the goal is, how do we move much more quickly and at scale? So, and this again speaks to your earlier question, do we need innovation or do we need scale? We need both. We need lots of it. We need it now.
Mm-hmm.
So if we can overcome these valleys of death, but both of those, whether it's through growth capital or through catalytic capital, the more the better, because we don't have any time to lose.
Actually, that would be a good way to close this conversation. But of course, we also want to give the opportunity to those who are joining us here. And I don't know whether there's anybody of you, Valeria, Jessica, Juan, Stanislav, whether you want to have a particular question that you would like to ask or comment to make. You don't have to, because Peter and myself, we have plenty of questions. We probably could sit here until the end of the evening, but just wanted to give you the opportunity as well. Okay, then we can continue asking questions. If I'm too, or maybe you are talking and you haven't unmuted yourself, but I still take this opportunity quickly before you, if maybe you're about to unmute yourself. I'm really interested in this process of how then the dialogue goes between the different people that are involved. I mean, it's impressive the different level of engagement and the different kind of actors that you involve in your lab ecosystem. I assume first it must be quite a challenge also to coordinate with them and then mobilize them and engage them, encourage them to engage in the first place. But then they need to work together on a solution, refine it. You explained earlier how there could be potential tensions, how they need to be resolved. So I assume there must be a process that is well facilitated in the way how people engage with each other, or is it just a joint Google Doc where everybody makes their expert remarks, and at the end of the day someone does the final editing in a final maybe and presents it in the final Zoom call at the end of the day? Can you tell us a little bit more about the process in particular?
Yes,
if I may,
that
just
would be messy.
Yeah, just maybe if I can add to that question, one aspect that has come out as being quite important in our earlier conversations we had, which is the aspect about learning. You explained earlier, it's not really about reinventing the wheel, but often it is about building on something that already existed in some other parts of the world, maybe, or has already been applied, and you're just developing an idea further. So that implies that everybody needs to be up to date with what's happening and needs to understand, have a really good understanding about these solutions, even though you explained also they're not so complicated at all. It's quite straightforward, but still, I assume there's also this element of explaining and learning for the individual that gets involved in this process. Is that something also where you see that you're adding value, and how are you facilitating this conversation, the engagement with the different actors in this process of really developing the financial instrument?
Well, just so starting with the selection process. So we have a fixed form. We work with a company called Submittable, who's been fantastic to just develop a really user-friendly, adaptable form that the proponents fill out and get, and that's where we basically offer guidance there through our website on exactly what we're looking for. Once we've refined the semi-finalists, so the short list that will end up going to the members, we have a pretty big team working on this. Usually it's about 25 people at the beginning of this process, working several days a week to do the initial screening. And we also put together what we call a strengths and weaknesses assessment. So this is just a one-pager that for the members, giving our input of what is the role of the lab, what is the value add, where are the strengths, where are the weaknesses of this idea according to lab criteria, and just a quick sort of one-liner about what it is. But then for full transparency, we include the full submission that we don't edit at all from the proponents. So they're able to see that and reference it, but they can also scan through very quickly and get our input on where the strengths and weaknesses are. Then we give them a couple of weeks to review this. They often have multiple team members looking through before we ask for their votes, basically. So that's the way that we engage previously. And then we have a number of virtual meetings. And prior to the pandemic, we held some of those in person, and then always held the global meeting in person. But it's actually been very smooth to host all of these things virtually. And it was, I think, fairly easy for us to pivot to a fully virtual model, since we've been running this virtual lab with members from all around the world joining video calls for the last several years, even before this, since it's such a global community. So it was a fairly seamless process to just make that fully virtual. In terms of the working groups, what we typically do is circulate materials, slides or versions of, say, the financial model, or draft documents to the group ahead of time to review, and then we host regular video calls with the whole group. We also typically have the teams doing bilateral interviews or check-ins with members as needed, just to make sure that we're benefiting from sort of that group dynamic, but also making sure that we can dig in a little bit deeper. Because say if you have someone who's an agronomist working as an academic, and then someone who's on the ground working in smallholder lending, and then you have a commercial banker and someone from a DFI, like they're all going to be speaking pretty different languages, even if they're all contributing to the development of this. So I think it's important to make those full group meetings fairly simple, and we have sort of slide templates and schedules, and those are fairly fixed in terms of the agenda, but then also leave room for a lot of flexibility and input via bilateral engagements. And then at the end, in certain cases, we do have Google Docs or a document living on Dropbox, which is typically what we use. We use a few other shared collaboration type platforms, but that's usually with a smaller group and only at the end in the context of one of the instrument groups, where they'll be giving input on drafts, and we'll refine that. That's usually later in the stage, July, August. It gets pretty busy, and our fortunately we have some really great communications and design folks. Another interesting piece is we have some visual designers that their whole job is basically turning numbers and quantitative data into visuals throughout CPI's
so
work, and they work really
yes.
closely with the proponents to look at the capital structure and put something together that's really intuitive. That's been a really helpful piece of this process. So having designers as well as the sort of technical experts engaging in this.
Wow, that is such an interesting aspect, because we are thinking a lot about this learning component, but of course it has also something to do with how the content is communicated, and to be able to offer that kind of visualization support to the solutions, and work with these proponents on making these ideas a bit more accessible is a really interesting thought here. Thank you very much for that.
I think that's the bit I just went, oh, I want to steal your designers. That sounds like that's a great resource to have, and yeah, most definitely. I'm aware of time. We did start a couple of minutes late, so we might just sort of go on till a couple of minutes past. So if anyone does have a burning question that they need to get out, the chance is still there in the next couple of minutes. But just very, very brief. I mean, I was just going to kind of touch on a quick question, if I may, that follows on from like the resources you're putting into this. I noticed that after the process, and you mentioned it earlier, you provide this a kind of follow-on technical assistance, for want of a better phrase. Once it's been endorsed, that you really go to work on the 25 days a year in support for the organizations, and you really kind of, or behind the instruments as well. And I just found that quite interesting in when I was looking at the process, just thinking by that point, the members are already engaged. So I wondered why you, or if you can talk to why you still think there's that gap there that you guys can provide that real kind of support. Does that make sense? Because I kind of, from an outside point of view, you see these wonderful organizations and members getting behind or swinging behind these ideas with a lot of resource and ideas. And I found it interesting that still there was a stumbling block to actually get these things going, where you're still providing that 25 days afterwards.
Yeah, the continued support, go-to-market support piece was added a few years ago, as we found that in some cases you're absolutely right. There's not much of a need for that if they're sort of at the stage where they've already started those funding conversations and are ready to raise capital. But in many cases, it just takes a really long time. And it's been helpful to segment the lab to where the first piece of it is really focused on getting the design right. And then we can move into the focus on fundraising. So having that split where there's the 25 days of go-to-market support after helps to basically split that up and also augment whatever's been happening through the lab cycle. It's just a lot to get done in 7 or 8 months, especially if your focus is split between doing sort of investor matchmaking and also just focusing on design. So it basically represents just a lengthening of the program, where that final piece is just more around the investor engagement. And you're right, in some cases the institutions are already engaged and it's not necessary, but we've found that in most cases it really is helpful to provide some capacity building and business development support and institutional development, especially for the smaller proponents. And it's very difficult, especially for say like a first-time fund manager. It takes years in many cases. 3 or 4 years has been the average for even our more commercially ready funds to hit first close or some key milestone, especially for those that have reached a fairly sizable close amount. So in the hundreds of millions. It's been 3 or 4 years on average of very hard work and investor conversations, sometimes with hundreds of institutions to find the right fit. So they really do benefit from that extra year.
Fantastic. Well, I'm aware that people have home to go to, and Anya's showing how dark it's getting in Berlin as well. So I think we can bring that to a close there. I still have about 101 questions, so you may get a random email at some point where I just go, and another thing. But it's been really interesting to learn a lot more about what you're doing, and it's a really impressive scale and approach. And it's also quite interesting, you reference quite a lot of times all the changes that you've made along the way. So I imagine it looks slightly different now to how it might have done when you started, but it's a really interesting model. So, I mean, I was going to bring it to a close there, and thank you very much for your time, unless anyone else has got anything burning. And we'll end the recording here with one last mention of our Impact for Breakfast event on the 30th of March and the design workshop on the 3rd of May, which hopefully, Ben, you're more than welcome, and be lovely to see you there as well. But also anyone else who's watching this video is more than welcome to join as well. So with that, thank you very much for your time, and we'll see you all very soon. Thank